Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Greg Shepard, and I started as an entrepreneur, done, 12 companies, and then exited them. And then most notably, I built a company that sold to eBay, and then we had a cross-border transaction carve out from eBay that I participated in, where we bought 14 companies, sold 12, bought another one of my companies and another company, and it won actually 4 private equity awards. It was a $925 million transaction, and Magento was actually one of those companies.
Wow. I mean, here in 29, you are a major Silicon Valley angel investor and VC, but it hasn't always been that way. And one of the reasons I invited you on the show today is I love sharing inspirational startup stories and from the world of tech, and how anybody listening can follow their dream and really make a difference. So can you share your story from humble beginnings to actually going on and not only achieving success, but actually giving away $3 million after your first big deal too? It's a fantastic story, it really is.
Yeah, so I, started, my mom was a nun, my dad was a priest. They left the church to take care of kids, and in doing so, they didn't have very much money. They really wanted to foster and adopt, so I was raised in a family of foster and adopted children. And then, we didn't have any money, so, I built my own businesses when I was a little kid. I used to sell Rubik's Cubes, and, actually, later on, when we were in a pretty rough neighborhood in Oakland, California, there was a lot of gangs and stuff. So my mom moved us to the country, and I would catch rattlesnakes and sell them as exotic pets to the pet store. And then the rattlesnakes ate rats, so I bought 2 rats, bred them, and then started feeding them so I could feed them the product. It was a 2-sided platform, basically. I could sell them the rattlesnakes and so. I started building tech companies, and built this one company and built it up and sold it. And like I said earlier, and it was really, really exciting. And there was a lot of people that really helped me. And so I gave away $3 million to the people that work for me. And it was the most inspiring thing I'd ever done. And it was full of magic to watch people, pay off student loans and put their kids through school and buy houses and, pay for their kids' weddings. And it was it was magical.
And that is what it's all about. And it's so refreshing to hear that story being told. And you have been on an incredibly inspirational journey. But in 2016, you sold 2 of your 4 companies to eBay. And I think it was over $900 million cross-brand deal, and have helped 12 plus companies get acquired. But for anybody listening at the beginning of their startup journey that could be going through a bit of a tough time at the moment, or trying to achieve funding, or so many other stages of that journey, what advice would you pass down to that person?
I would say, first of all, I'm working on a TED Talk that I'm doing later, and I tell them you need a handful of things, and that each finger in the handful is focus, drive, enthusiasm, discipline, and optimism. And those things I think are critical. That's one thing I would tell them. And the other thing I would tell them, I think, is, and this is something that I always get into debates about with investors, is that when you start building a business, you have to understand who your buyer is. And a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people say, oh, well, I'm building a business. I don't need to know that's down the road. And I tell them, I say, well, listen, if you don't have an ideal buyer profile and an ideal customer profile, and you don't know that ideal customer profile is the same ideal customer profile as your buyer, that's going to put you in a really bad situation. You may have worked on your company for years, and it's not like you work on your company, build it up, and then you go find a buyer. You have to have a buyer the whole time. You have to be creating a relationship, doing partnerships and things like that. So I tell people, I'm like, if you were to build a product, you would have a customer in mind. You would be solving a problem for a customer. Well, your whole company, to a good buyer, to a strategic buyer, is just a product to them. Most of the time, they don't need your customers, not the good strategics, not the good synergies. They have customers, and they've already paid for them. The customer acquisition cost has already been absorbed. So if you're building a company and you make sure that your buyer and their buyer is aligned, they see acquiring you as an additional extension to their existing investment in their current customers. And your whole go-to-market strategy should be aligned with that. I see people raising capital, and I, in my own investments too, where I say, they're like, I want to raise $5 million. And I'm like, well, why do you want to raise $5 million? And they say, well, because I have a go-to-market strategy that's $3 million. And I say, well, what is your go-to-market strategy? Well, it's going out and acquiring customers. Well, why are you going to go out and acquire all these customers? Well, because I want to have revenue. Well, why do you need revenue? Is the buyer that's buying your company because you have revenue? Because if they're a $40 billion company or a $10 million company or a $100 million company, and they're buying your company and you're like, and you've got like, 2-3 million in revenue or whatever it is, it's insignificant to them. They don't care about that. What they care about is growth, margin, and retention. Growth says people want to buy your product. Margin says you can do it at scale, and retention says people want to hold on to your product. And attachment rate is when you have a buyer and you acquire some of their clients and show those 3 drivers on their clients, on their current customers. And that's how you sell a company. And so you have to start with that in mind. Otherwise, you raise capital you don't need, you burn it where you don't need. And by the time you turn around and say, okay, now I want to sell my company, you're starting on that process. And that process takes, a year to 2 years, where you start working with their customers and you prove growth, margin, retention with their customers. And you show that over a period of 12, 24 months. And then you go and you set up a partnership with them. And then you take a little investment from them and then they buy your company. And that's the pattern that I've seen repeatedly. And I get into a lot of arguments with investors and I look at their track record. I'm like, what did your close? How many deals out of the ones you invest in fail? And they're like 9 out of 10. And I'm like, well, I don't have, mine's 12 for 12. So, there you go.
That's a pretty good batting average, isn't it? You can't get any better than that.
Yeah.
So, I was just about to ask, why do so many startups struggle to get acquired from your experience? But it sounds like you've answered it there. And is it all because of not doing that early work around growth, margin, and retention and kind of skipping those steps, would you say?
I think it has to do with that, but I also think it has to do with them not planning for the acquisition, right? So, if you're building a company that sells widgets, and you have a better widget than everybody else has, or you have a bolt-on to an existing widget, then when you go out, you need to identify, I call them your ideal buyer profile. So you go out and you find 3 to 5 companies that would buy your company. And then you justify that acquisition by building user stories. So I am X and I want to Y so that I can Z, right? And when you build that out, then you say, okay, who are their customers? And what are their customers' ideal profile? And then you go out and acquire their customers. So let's say they have a base, which is their total customer size, and I'm just using random numbers all over here, but let's say they have 1,000 customers. And you say to them, I'm going to acquire 10% of your, you don't tell them this, but in your head, you say, I'm going to acquire 10% of this buyer's customers. And then you get, out of that 10%, you get 50%. You've shown a 50% growth rate on their customers. That's attachment. Now, if you retain those for 12 to 24 months, you're showing that you can retain them for 12 to 24 months. Now, if you show that you can scale, meaning you can actually, have margins increase and show economies of scale over time, now you have the magic trio, right? That trio on their base makes it so why wouldn't they buy you? You've proven to them already that you're a perfect acquisition for them.